There is a date that should have stopped more people in their tracks than it did, July 11th, 2026. On that day, a senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval commander named Mohammed Azabata was reported dead after his vehicle overturned on the Yezd-Kerman highway in southeastern Iran. Iranian authorities announced an investigation had been opened. Government officials stepped in front of microphones and told the public, told journalists, told anyone paying attention not to speculate. And on that exact same day, Kurdish fighters were conducting coordinated, simultaneous armed attacks against IRGC positions across a 200-kilometer arc of mountain terrain in western Iran. 4 separate engagements, 4 confirmed IRGC security personnel killed. 4 different locations spread across some of the most strategically significant geography in the entire region. And the Iranian regime responded to none of it with anything resembling transparency, honesty, or even acknowledgement of the full scope of what was unfolding inside its own borders. That is not a bad week. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And the pattern is accelerating in ways that the mainstream coverage of this war has almost entirely failed to address, failed to explain, and in many cases failed to even notice. To understand what happened on July 11th and what it means for everything that comes after it, you cannot just look at the last 10 days. You have to look at the last several decades, because the specific sequence of events now unfolding in the Zagros Mountains is something that the IRGC has quietly feared since the very first day the Islamic Republic came to power. The threat was always there. The conditions for it were always present. What has changed is that those conditions have now converged in a way they never quite managed to converge before, and the result is something that demands serious, sustained, honest attention. The war that most people have been watching is the one playing out in the Strait of Hormuz, the American strikes, the Iranian missile salvos, the ships that were sunk, the radar installations dismantled strike by strike over weeks of sustained American air campaign. That war is real. Its outcome matters enormously, but it is the visible layer. It is the surface of a conflict that has multiple dimensions operating simultaneously beneath it, and the dimension that almost nobody is watching right now may ultimately prove more consequential than anything that has happened in the Persian Gulf. Because while the world's cameras have been pointed at shipping lanes and naval exchanges, something has been igniting in the mountains. Something quiet, something patient, something that has been building toward this moment for a very long time. On the same day that Mohammed Azabata, the IRGC Navy's political deputy and official public spokesperson, the man who spent months standing at a podium threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz and who had been sanctioned by the European Union, specifically for his role in restricting Hormuz navigation, was reported dead on that highway. Iranian security forces were simultaneously absorbing armed attacks in Parveh, in Kermanshah province, in Baneh, in Kurdistan province, in Marivan, and in Mahabad, in West Azerbaijan province. 4 engagements, 4 locations spread across 200 kilometers of mountain terrain, all of them within a single 24-hour window. Read that geography again, because it matters more than any single detail in this story. Those locations are not random. They are not opportunistic strikes chosen because they were easy targets. They are the specific towns and border zones that sit along the Zagros mountain range, the ancient geographic spine of western Iran that separates the Iranian interior from the Kurdistan region of Iraq. The people who hit those 4 locations simultaneously know that terrain intimately. They have operated in it for years. Some of them have operated in it for generations. Their fathers operated in it. Their grandfathers understood its ridgelines, its seasonal passes, its natural choke points. And the fact that 4 separate engagements occurred across 200 kilometers in a single day is not the fingerprint of a scattered, disorganized insurgency running on desperation and impulse. That is the signature of something coordinated, something planned. Something that has a command structure behind it, capable of synchronizing multiple independent units across a massive geographic spread and hitting on the same day with enough precision to communicate a message that the raw numbers alone cannot fully deliver. The IRGC is calling it terrorism. Of course they are. The regime that has funded Hezbollah, that has armed Hamas, that has built and deployed proxy networks across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen for 4 decades, is calling the people fighting back against it terrorists. The regime whose own commanders have stood at podiums threatening to sink ships in international waterways, the regime that has sponsored more organized political violence across the Middle East than perhaps any other single actor in the region's modern history, is reaching for the terrorism label to describe armed men attacking military positions in the mountains. The irony would be almost poetic if the stakes were not so catastrophic. Now let's talk about who is actually in those mountains, because understanding the Kurdish coalition that has come together over the past year is absolutely essential to understanding why what happened 10 days ago is not a one-time event. It is the opening movement of something larger, something that has been organizing itself in the shadows while the visible war consumed all available attention. Kurds make up roughly 10 to 12% of Iran's population. They have lived along the western border for over 400 years. They have been fighting the Islamic Republic in one form or another since 1979, since the moment Ayatollah Khomeini declared jihad against them in the opening months of the regime he had just built. That declaration of jihad was not a policy dispute. It was not a disagreement over governance or resource allocation. It was the founding leadership of the Islamic Republic telling a significant portion of its own population that their existence was fundamentally incompatible with the revolution's vision, that there was no place for them inside the project that was being constructed. The Kurds have spent the decades since living with the consequences of that declaration, absorbing the violence it authorized, and never quite giving up the idea that their situation would one day change. But the coalition facing the IRGC today is not the scattered, underfunded, politically fragmented resistance of the 1980s. Something changed in the months leading into this war, and the change is structural in a way that previous moments of Kurdish resistance never quite managed to be. On February 22nd of this year, 6 days before the opening phase of Operation Fury began, 5 major Iranian Kurdish political parties formally unified under what became known as the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan. Their stated goal was unambiguous: topple the Iranian regime, achieve Kurdish self-determination. For the first time in their modern history as a political movement, these groups achieved both political and military coordination under a unified command structure. That is not a small development buried in regional news. That is a transformation in the organizational capacity of the internal resistance that fundamentally changes the strategic calculus of this entire conflict. Here is who is now in the room, and each of these groups matters individually before you can understand what they represent collectively. The PJAK, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, and its armed wing, the YRK. Atlantic Council analysis has assessed the YRK as having fielded the most capable fighters in the coalition, some of them women, operating primarily out of the Qandil mountain range near the Iran-Iraq border. PJAK has reportedly been responsible for roughly 70% of all Kurdish armed attacks on the Iranian regime since 2014. Some of its fighters trained alongside American forces during the campaign against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. These are not militia amateurs who have never operated in a combined arms environment. They are experienced fighters who understand how American and allied forces work, who understand what air support looks like from the ground, and who have been in sustained combat operations against a state military before. The PDKI, the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, is the oldest and most established group in the coalition, founded in 1945, having led past insurgencies against both the Shah and against the Islamic Republic. It carries institutional memory, political relationships, and a reputation inside the Kurdish population that newer organizations cannot replicate. Its presence in the coalition lends the alliance a legitimacy that matters both inside Iran and in international diplomatic channels, where the question of who speaks for the Kurdish people is always contested and always consequential. The PAK, the Kurdistan Freedom Party, was founded in 1991 and fought alongside Kurdish forces against ISIS before the current conflict began. Critically, the PAK was already attacking IRGC positions in Kermanshah and Loristan provinces before the war formally opened. They were not waiting for permission or for a signal. They were already in the fight, already taking the operational risk, already demonstrating that the threshold for armed action had been crossed. Rounding out the coalition are the Kamala organization and the KDPI's various affiliated Peshmerga forces, bringing their own decades of operational experience in the specific border terrain where the current fight is concentrated. The estimated combined strength of this coalition sits at approximately 2,500 fighters based in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, with established cross-border infiltration routes into the Zagros mountain terrain. 2,500 fighters who know every ravine, every ridgeline, every natural choke point, and every IRGC checkpoint across 200 kilometers of mountain terrain that the regime nominally controls. And that number does not account for local sympathizers, intelligence networks, supply chain participants, and civilian support structures inside Iran that have been built over years of patient organizational work. But here is the detail that changes the capability equation entirely, and it is the detail that most analysis of the Kurdish resistance has consistently missed or underweighted. The weapons load that these fighters have historically operated with is light infantry, K-pattern rifles, RPG launchers, mortars, effective in mountain terrain, lethal in ambushes, but fundamentally limited against armored vehicles, fixed positions with organic air defense, and the kind of concentrated IRGC counteroffensive that has historically been the ceiling on what Kurdish resistance could accomplish. Light infantry eventually loses that fight even in favorable terrain, even when the geography is on your side, even when you know every pass and every ridgeline. The IRGC can mass armored vehicles, helicopters, and artillery against any position fighters try to hold. That was the problem that decades of Kurdish resistance never solved. The ceiling was structural, and the ceiling has now moved. FPV kamikaze drones, the same sub-$500 systems that transformed the tactical fight on the Ukrainian front and showed the world that the economics of warfare had permanently shifted, are proliferating across the Middle East faster than most analysts anticipated. A Kurdish unit operating in Zagros mountain terrain with FPV drone swarms and ISR overhead does not need an air force to dominate the choke points that armor must move through. The mountains create natural bottlenecks that generations of light infantry already knew how to exploit. Now add eyes in the sky that can see every IRGC vehicle before it reaches that bottleneck, and a loitering munition that costs less than a single tank shell to deploy against it. The IRGC is bringing armor to a mountain fight where the mountains do not care about armor, and where a drone costing less than the average person's monthly rent can remove that armor from the operational equation before it even reaches the engagement zone. The Switchblade class of loitering munitions has already been documented in this theater. ISR platforms, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance drones that carry no weapons but provide persistent overhead observation give a small ground unit the targeting picture that previously required a fully staffed intelligence cell and dedicated aviation support to generate. The combination of cheap FPV systems, loitering munitions, and ISR overhead is not a partial solution to the Kurdish capability gap. It is the solution. It removes the IRGC's primary asymmetric advantage in mountain terrain and turns the geography back into the force multiplier it has always been for the people who know it best. And this brings us to the question that nobody inside official channels wants to answer out loud, but that the operational picture demands asking directly. How exactly does a sophisticated, multi-party, politically unified military coalition, one that received direct diplomatic encouragement from a sitting American president, one that was actively being positioned for a cross-border offensive earlier this year, one that formally unified its command structure 6 days before a major American military operation began, show up running coordinated simultaneous attacks across 200 kilometers of Iranian mountain terrain with apparently no external support whatsoever? Coordinated attacks, synchronized timing, multiple simultaneous engagements across a geographic spread that requires communication infrastructure, planning capacity, and logistics that light infantry with AK rifles does not inherently possess. The official record on American support is complicated in the way that official records on sensitive operations tend to be complicated. President Trump stated publicly that he would be entirely supportive if the Kurds chose to move against Iran. Israeli reporting confirmed that plans were being developed for Iranian Kurdish militias to seize border areas inside Iran with active Israeli backing. Congressional Research Service analysis noted that the opening phase of American and Allied airstrikes had already done the shaping work along the Iran-Iraq border, degrading Iranian command nodes, air defenses, and the logistics networks that had previously constrained Kurdish cross-border activity. The groundwork, analytically, had been laid. Then Turkey intervened. Regional reports describe Turkish President Erdogan making a direct personal appeal to persuade American leadership to scrap the formal Kurdish arming plan after details of the arrangement were allegedly communicated to Ankara through channels that should not have had access to that information. Turkey's position was straightforward and has been consistent for decades. Any Kurdish offensive that benefited PJAK, given PJAK's organizational ties to the PKK, which Ankara designates as a terrorist organization, was unacceptable to Turkey regardless of the operational benefit it provided against Iran. The official pipeline was reportedly shut down. But the attacks are happening, the coordination is visible, the simultaneity is documented, and the specific geography of the attacks, the specific provinces, the specific towns, the specific terrain features, aligns precisely with what pre-war planning documents described as the intended operational zone for a Kurdish cross-border offensive. Something either never fully stopped or something has quietly restarted through channels that provide all parties with the plausible deniability they need to maintain their official positions. The answer to which one is true matters enormously for understanding the next phase of this conflict, because the answer determines whether what happened on July 11th was a one-time demonstration or the opening of a sustained campaign with external enablement behind it. Now add the Azabata situation to all of this, because his death on that highway does not exist in isolation from everything else happening around it. Mohammed Azabata was not a minor figure on the organizational chart of the IRGC. He was the political deputy and official public spokesperson of the IRGC Navy, the face of the organization that spent the last several months standing at podiums threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz. The man whose public appearances were the regime's chosen instrument for signaling its willingness to escalate the maritime conflict. He had been sanctioned by the European Union specifically for his role in the Hormuz pressure campaign. He was personally connected to figures at the absolute top of the IRGC naval command structure. This was someone embedded in the senior tier of the organization, running the strategic deterrent that the IRGC believed would force the international community to negotiate on its terms. His vehicle overturned on the Yaza-Kerman highway. Iranian authorities opened an investigation. The Fars news agency, the IRGC's own media outlet, its official mouthpiece, reported the accident. Police and emergency crews attended the scene. Azabata was evacuated to a medical center where he died from his injuries, and the Iranian government told the public not to speculate. Analysts who have spent years studying how the Iranian regime manages information around sensitive events have documented a consistent and recognizable pattern. When the regime experiences a high-profile elimination that it cannot publicly attribute to an adversary without triggering a mandatory and escalatory public response, it is not currently positioned to deliver, it reaches for the accident narrative. Vehicle accidents, natural causes, heart attacks, convenient highway incidents. The Iranian government's track record of timed vehicle malfunctions and medical events involving senior officials is long enough and consistent enough to constitute its own data set, its own documentary record of how the regime handles the deaths it cannot afford to acknowledge. And right now, in the middle of active nuclear negotiations in Doha, with the military situation deteriorating, with internal resistance cells operating in multiple cities simultaneously, the IRGC is not positioned to respond to anything that would further expand the scope of the conflict it is already struggling to manage. So it calls it an accident. It says don't speculate. And it hopes the world moves on before too many people notice the timing. Here is the larger context that frames all of this and gives the timing its full meaning. There is a clock running in the background of every single event described above, and that clock changes the meaning of everything happening around it. Iran signed a memorandum of understanding with the United States on June 17th of this year. The agreement opened a 60-day negotiation window designed to produce a formal arrangement addressing Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile development, and the status of the Strait of Hormuz. The terms on the Iranian side are significant. No uranium enrichment, destruction of existing enriched uranium stockpiles, limitations on ballistic missile range, a defined arrangement governing Hormuz navigation, In exchange, Iran would receive sanctions relief, access to frozen assets, and the ability to sell oil on international markets again. For a regime whose economy has been strangled by sanctions for years and whose oil revenues have been decimated by the conflict, the economic relief on offer is not trivial. It is the difference between the regime being able to function and the regime collapsing under its own financial weight. As of July 11th, approximately 24 days of that 60-day window had elapsed. 36 days remained, and in those 24 days, the following has happened. The new supreme leader, whose appointment the regime hoped would signal continuity and stability, has not appeared publicly, has released no verified proof of life, and has provided no visible evidence of command authority. Kurdish fighters have conducted coordinated multi-location attacks inside Iran. Resistance cells in Tehran, Isfahan, and Tabriz have been documented installing regime change messaging in public spaces, coordinating their actions to coincide with the Free Iran 2026 Global Summit held outside Paris, where opposition leadership described the regime as having reached its final phase. A senior IRGC naval commander is dead on a highway, and the military campaign against Iranian infrastructure has continued without the pause that the negotiation window might have implied would follow from diplomatic engagement. The IRGC's strategic position in these negotiations is built on a single foundation, the Strait of Hormuz. The organization has spent years constructing what its own internal doctrine effectively treats as its ultimate bargaining chip, not a nuclear device, but the strait itself, the geographic choke point through which so much of the world's oil must flow. Held hostage by the IRGC's demonstrated ability to threaten and sink commercial shipping, to collapse maritime insurance markets, to make the economic cost of continued conflict so high that the international community would eventually reach for a negotiated solution that preserved the regime's core interests. The theory was sound as long as the regime's internal cohesion held. The strait is only leverage when the organization capable of threatening it can maintain operational discipline, when the command structure functions efficiently enough to actually execute the threat, when the population accepts the cost of the conflict, and when no alternative power centers inside Iran emerge with enough credibility to offer the world a different option. All four of those requirements are now under simultaneous pressure in ways that are visible, documented, and accelerating. The internal resistance campaign running parallel to the Kurdish mountain offensive represents a dimension of this conflict that is almost entirely invisible in mainstream coverage but deserves specific attention. On June 29th, resistance units launched a coordinated campaign across Tehran, Isfahan, and Tabriz. Not armed attacks, but organized public action, posters installed, graffiti painted, messaging distributed that explicitly called for regime change. The timing was deliberate. The action was coordinated to coincide with the Free Iran 2026 Global Summit convening outside Paris that same week, where opposition leadership from the National Council of Resistance of Iran described the regime as having reached its terminal phase, specifically citing the appointment of the new supreme leader as the event that could precipitate the final collapse of the system. The opposition was speaking at an international forum outside Iran's borders, while its cells inside Iran were demonstrating organizational capacity in 3 of the country's largest cities simultaneously. The message being sent was layered and intentional. We are here. We are coordinated. We exist inside the country, not just in exile. We can act when we choose to act. The Zagros Mountains are answering a question that the air campaign alone could never resolve. Can the Iranian regime survive simultaneous external military pressure and internal armed resistance without a command structure capable of managing both at the same time? The 4 attacks on a single day 10 days ago were not the answer to that question. They were the question being asked out loud, in a coordinated, documented, impossible-to-deny way. For the first time, the IRGC can call it terrorism. The Iranian government can open an investigation and tell the world not to speculate. A senior naval commander can die on a highway, and the official story can be a vehicle accident, with the investigation pending. All of that can be maintained on the surface. Underneath the surface, the mountains are still there, the fighters are still there, the coordination that produced 4 simultaneous attacks across 200 kilometers of terrain is still there. And 36 days remain on a negotiation clock that nobody inside the regime can stop from running out if the pressure from those mountains does not slow down. It is not slowing down.